before borders, long before highways cut the desert open, before maps gave names to canyons and rivers, the Southwest was ruled by one law only: water was life. In the high deserts and red canyons, water did not flow freely. It hid, it waited, it tested. Streams appeared only where the land allowed them, carving narrow veins through stone older than memory. Springs bubbled up in places no one could explain, then vanished again without warning. To live here meant understanding that water was never owned, only borrowed, and yet there were places where water lingered unnaturally. Pools tucked into canyon shadows where sunlight barely reached, slow-moving bends of rivers where the current softened, deepened, and grew strangely still. Natural basins carved into rock that never seemed to dry, even during seasons when the land cracked and the sky forgot how to rain. The elders warned against these places, not loudly, not with threats. They warned the people do when they know something listens. They said the water there was occupied. Among the Pueblo, Navajo, Apache, and other southwestern tribes, stories passed quietly from one generation to the next, never shouted, never told for entertainment. These were not campfire tales. They were instructions disguised as memory. They spoke of water babies, small, pale, child-sized shapes that moved beneath the surface, sometimes glimpsed at dawn, sometimes heard when the wind died and the desert held its breath. They were said to cry softly, like infants left alone too long, their voices carrying unnaturally far through stone corridors and canyon walls. Not all who heard them lived. The elders said water babies were not spirits in the way people wanted them to be. They were not ghosts, not demons, not gods. They were remnants, things that belonged to the water now. The stories claimed that long ago, during times of famine, drought, and war, children were lost to rivers, springs, and floods. Some slipped, some were carried away, some were given. In desperate years, when hunger hollowed villages and rain refused to come, offerings were made to water sources believed to be sacred. Not sacrifices spoken aloud, but understandings reached in silence, the kind history does not write down. The water remembered. It did not let go, and over time, the children did not leave either. They changed. Those who encountered water babies described them inconsistently, yet always with the same unease. Sometimes they appeared almost human, smooth faces, wide eyes reflecting light wrong, hair drifting as if underwater even when the surface was calm. Other times they were distorted, limbs too thin, movements too sudden, smiles too wide. But the most terrifying detail was this: they learned voices. Water babies could imitate the sounds of crying children, calling for help from beneath the surface. They could echo familiar names. They could shape their voices to sound like someone you loved, someone you trusted. A mother would hear her child crying near a pool where no child should be. A hunter would hear laughter where the canyon was empty. A traveler would hear a splash behind him, then silence. Those who stepped closer rarely returned the same. Some vanished entirely. Others came back altered, quiet, hollow-eyed, refusing to drink water again for the rest of their lives. They would sit for hours staring at the ground, flinching at the sound of flowing water, whispering about hands tugging at their ankles, about cold pulling them downward while voices begged them to stay. The tribes did not hunt water babies, they avoided them. You do not fight water in the desert, you respect it, or it takes more than your life. Parents warned children never to play near deep pools, never to follow sounds they could not see, never to linger at water sources after sunset, especially never at dawn or dusk, the hours when the boundary between surface and depth thinned. And always, always, if you heard crying near water when no one stood, you turned away, even if your heart broke, even if every instinct screamed to help, because the water babies did not want kindness, they wanted company. And the desert, vast and silent, had learned long ago how to keep secrets for those who listened. The rivers continued to flow, the pools remained full, and beneath the surface something waited, patient as stone, eternal as thirst, listening for footsteps, learning new voices, preparing to call again. As the generations passed, the land itself became a map of warnings. Certain places were named not for what they were, but for what happened there. A bend in a river where the current slowed unnaturally, called the listening water. A spring hidden between red stone walls where echoes lingered too long. A pool at the base of a canyon waterfall where the depth could never be measured, no matter how many stones were dropped. These were not places people settled near. They were places people passed around. Travelers learned to recognize them instinctively. The air felt heavier. Sound behaved strangely. Footsteps seemed louder, then suddenly muted. The wind, so constant across the desert, often refused to enter these spaces, leaving the water unnaturally still. Animals sensed it first. Deer approached such pools cautiously, lowering their heads but never drinking deeply. Horses snorted and pulled away, hooves scraping stone in agitation. Birds circled above but avoided landing, as if something beneath the surface unsettled them. And sometimes, just sometimes, ripples appeared in water untouched by wind. Stories told of hunters who stopped to drink water after long days under the sun, men hardened by heat and hunger, familiar with danger, who trusted their senses. They knelt at the edge of a pool, cupped their hands and froze, because beneath the reflection of sky and stone they saw movement, not fish, not shadows, small shapes shifting just beyond clarity, too smooth, too deliberate. Faces would rise close enough to distort the surface tension, eyes reflecting light with a brightness no human pupil possessed. Mouths opened as if to speak, but the water swallowed the sound before it reached ear. Those who ran survived, those who hesitated did not. One story whispered among elders told of a group traveling between villages during a particularly dry year. Their water skins were nearly empty. When they found a hidden pool tucked into a narrow canyon, relief overcame caution. The youngest among them heard it first, a laugh, high, soft, almost joyful. The sound bounced off canyon walls, magnified and distorted. It sounded close, too close to ignore. The others heard it moments later, followed by crying, then by words shaped awkwardly as if learned recently. "Help me." The words were wrong, the rhythm off, the tone hollow. Still, one man stepped forward. The elder said he reached the water's edge and stared down for a long time, unmoving. When the others tried to pull him back, he resisted, not violently, but gently, as if listening to instructions only he could hear. Then he stepped into the pool. There was no splash, no struggle, just ripples spreading outward in perfect circles, fading too quickly. The crying stopped. The group fled, abandoning supplies, direction, even each other in their panic. They never returned to that canyon. Years later, when drought worsened, people avoided that route entirely, even if it meant days of additional travel, because the water there had learned. Children were taught early to recognize the signs. If water reflected the sky too clearly, it was dangerous. If it remained cold even under the noon sun, it was dangerous. If you felt watched while standing near it, it was dangerous. But the most feared sign was silence. Flowing water makes sound. Even still pools breathe faintly. But water baby places sometimes swallowed all noise, leaving an oppressive quiet that pressed against the ears. In that silence, people reported hearing their own thoughts grow louder, memories surfacing uninvited, guilt and longing twisting together. The elders said the water babies used these emotions. They were drawn to sadness, to loneliness, to those who carried grief too heavy for the desert to ignore. The water reflected not just faces, but regret. Some claimed the water babies appeared most often during times of imbalance, after floods, during prolonged droughts, following war or famine. When the natural order strained, the water stirred, and the children beneath remembered they were not alone. At night, campfires were kept far from rivers. Songs were sung loudly when crossing water paths, not for comfort but for protection. Human eyes to drown out whispers rising from below. Mothers held their children tighter when passing springs, murmuring prayers that blended gratitude with apology. Because the water did not forget. It remembered every footstep that lingered too long, every tear that fell into it, every moment of weakness that brought someone close to its edge. And deep beneath the surface, where lights fractured and time lost meaning, the water babies waited, listening, practicing new sounds, shaping new words, preparing to call again. They were never in a hurry. Water in the desert understands patience better than anything alive. As the stories deepened, a pattern emerged, one the elders rarely spoke of openly. Water babies did not appear everywhere. They appeared where children once vanished. Not all losses were sudden. Some were accidents, slips along slick stone, flash floods that came without warning, swollen rivers that swallowed laughter mid-sound. Others were quieter, heavier, wrapped in desperation and silence. During years when the rain failed and crops withered into dust, families faced choices no story ever wants to remember. Food disappeared, game migrated, infants cried through nights that stretched endlessly beneath empty skies, and water, precious, sacred water, became something bargained with. The elders said no one ever admitted what happened, but the water knew. It remembered the weight of small bodies lowered into its depths, the heat of tears falling into its surface, the prayers whispered not for forgiveness, but for survival. The water babies were not born from cruelty. They were born from loss, and loss, when soaked into stone and water for generations, becomes something else entirely. Those who claim to have seen water babies up close described an unsettling familiarity. Their faces sometimes resembled the children of the villages nearby, not identical, but close enough to stir recognition. A curve of cheek, a familiar gaze, a voice that almost matched a memory. This was what made them so dangerous. They did not frighten at first glance, they invited. One account spoke of a young girl fetching water at dusk. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, expecting her younger brother. Instead, she saw a small figure standing knee-deep in the pool, water lapping calmly around its legs. The child smiled. It waved. The girl later said the smile wasn't wrong, just unfinished, as if the muscles hadn't learned how to rest. The eyes were too reflective, mirroring the sky even as clouds passed overhead. The girl froze. The figure tilted its head and spoke her brother's name perfectly, not as imitation, as memory. Something ancient had learned the shape of that sound. The elders said the girl survived only because she dropped her water jar and ran without looking back. When others returned later, They found tiny footprints pressed into wet stone leading into the pool, not out of it. As if the water had briefly released one of its own. Water babies were said to mature not in body, but in cunning. The longer they remained beneath the surface, the more skilled they became at calling, at choosing voices that pulled hardest at the heart, at sensing which passerby carried doubt, grief, or longing heavy enough to draw them closer. They did not attack, they persuaded. This was why warriors feared them more than enemies. You could fight a blade, you could flee an animal, but persuasion, especially when shaped like a child's cry, slipped past reason and went straight for the soul. Some who escaped water babies reported dreams that followed them for years, dreams of floating, of cold hands tugging gently, not violently, of voices asking questions rather than demanding obedience. Stay, don't be alone. It's quiet here. The dreams never threatened, they tempted. Elders warned that those who dreamed too often eventually returned to water without remembering why. They would wander away from camps at night, drawn toward rivers as if sleepwalking. Sometimes they were found standing at the water's edge at dawn, feet submerged, staring downward. Sometimes they were never found. To protect against this, rituals were performed, not to banish the water babies, but to distance them. Songs were sung that reminded the water of balance. Stones were placed at certain pools to mark boundaries. Names of the lost were spoken aloud, not to call them back, but to acknowledge them, because ignoring the water babies made them louder. Acknowledging them kept them quiet, but the desert changed. As people moved, as outsiders arrived, as roads cut through canyons and dams reshaped rivers, the old knowledge thinned. Warnings faded. Sacred pools became swimming holes. Spring became stops for travelers who did not know which waters remembered too much. And the water babies, patient, eternal, adopted. They learned new voices, new languages, new ways to call. They waited for the sound of laughter instead of mourning, for footsteps without fear, for people who no longer believed but could listen. And when belief fades, ancient things move closer to the surface. The trouble did not begin when the water appeared. It began when people stopped believing they were there. As the Southwest changed, the old boundaries dissolved quietly. Roads cut through canyons once avoided, bridges crossed rivers once approached only with ceremony. Springs that had been marked, named, and respected for centuries were catalogued, fenced, or worse, advertised. What had once been sacred became recreational. Children laughed where elders once whispered. Swimming holes formed in places the sun barely touched, fed by hidden channels deep beneath the rock. Tourists leapt into water without knowing its depth, its history, or its memory. They splashed, shouted, and left offerings of trash and noise behind. And beneath the surface, something listened. The water babies did not react immediately. They had survived centuries of drought and war. They understood patience. But when the old rules were broken often enough, something shifted. People began to disappear again, not in numbers large enough to alarm, not dramatically enough to make headlines. A hiker who slipped near a canyon pool, a child who wandered too close to the riverbank, a swimmer pulled under by a current no one could explain. Authorities called them accidents. The land knew better. Survivors described the same details, even when separated by years and miles. The water felt colder than expected. Hands brushed ankles. Sounds echoed strangely, as if coming from beneath rather than around them. And always voices, not screaming, not threatening, familiar. One man who barely survived being pulled under a narrow river bend later confessed that water nearly killed him wasn't the current. It was hesitation. He said he heard his own daughter calling to him from underwater, laughing, telling him it was safe. She was at home. The moment he realized this, panic broke the spell. He fought upward, lungs burning, and collapsed on the bank, coughing water that tasted metallic and old. For weeks afterward, he refused to drink anything but sealed bottles. Even then, he said he sometimes heard knocking sounds from inside the pipes at night. Tribal elders watching these events unfold felt a deep, familiar dread. The water babies were no longer confined to forgotten places. They were adapting to crowds. Modern noise did not repel them, it masked them. Laughter, music, splashing, all of it helped conceal the sounds they made beneath the surface. Their voices blended in, harder to identify, easier to mistake. And something else had changed. They were becoming curious. Elders said water babies once stayed close to the pools that birthed them. But now they followed water whatever it flowed, down rivers, through irrigation channels, into reservoirs and artificial lakes. The old boundaries meant nothing to concrete and steel. The water carried them forward. In some stories, water babies were seen farther from their origins than ever before. Near dam spillways, along canals cutting through desert towns, beneath bridges lit by street lamps, places that should have been safe, places people trusted. Children reported seeing other kids underwater while fishing from banks. Campers described small shapes darting beneath docks. Kayakers felt tugs against their hulls where no debris existed. And when confronted, the water fell silent. Elders warned that water babies did not grow angry at disrespect. They grew lonely. Loneliness made them bold. It made them reach higher, closer to the surface, closer to people who had forgotten the cost of ignoring old stories. Their cries changed, too, less desperate, more playful, less obvious, more convincing. Some said they were learning joy. Others feared they were learning hunger. The desert watched all of this without judgment. It had seen civilizations rise and vanish before, but the water, once carefully balanced between scarcity and reverence, now flowed freely where it never had, carrying with it memories meant to remain buried. And beneath rippling reflections of blue sky and drifting clouds, something small and ancient pressed close to the surface, testing the thinness between past and present, waiting for someone who would listen, waiting for someone who would step too close. Not everyone taken by the water vanished. That was the detail that unsettled the elders the most. Some people came back. They were found hours later on riverbanks they could not explain reaching, pulled from pools with no memory of how they survived, discovered miles downstream from where they entered the water, bodies unbroken, lungs inexplicably clear. But something about them was wrong. They avoided water instinctively. Ever rain, the sound of flowing streams made them flinch. Mirrors unsettled them, especially when light reflected across glass the way sunlight danced on ripples. Many complained of hearing splashing noises in places where water could not exist, inside homes, beneath floorboards, behind walls. And all of them shared one habit. They whispered in their sleep. Those who listened closely described the same phrases repeated over and over. Short sentences, half-formed thoughts. It's warm. They're waiting. Don't leave me alone. One woman rescued from a canyon pool after being submerged for nearly 3 minutes insisted she had not been drowning. She claimed the water held her gently, suspending her weightless, while small hands pressed against her chest and shoulders, not restraining, but steadying. She said she was surrounded by children, not swimming, standing on invisible ground beneath the surface, hair floating upward, eyes wide and unblinking. They watched her calmly, curiously, as if observing something rare. One stepped forward and touched her face. The touch was cold but careful. The child smiled and asked her name. When she answered, the child repeated it slowly, practicing the sound. She was released moments later, pushed upward hard enough to break the surface, gasping, alone. Afterward, she could no longer enter water deeper than her ankles. Showers made her panic. Reflections on polished floors unsettled her. She began leaving bowls of water outside her home at night, claiming it helped keep them busy. No one could explain why. The elders had an explanation. Water babies did not always want to take. Sometimes they wanted to learn. Those who returned had been marked, not visibly, not physically, but in ways the water recognized. They had been seen, catalogued, remembered. Their names had been added to a growing collection carried beneath the surface. These survivors were not haunted because they escaped. They were haunted because they were chosen. Elders warned families to watch such people closely. They were vulnerable, not to the water babies themselves, but to the pull that followed. The water would call more often, dreams would deepen, temptation would sharpen, and eventually the call would feel less like danger and more like relief. Some resisted their entire lives, others did not. One elder spoke quietly of a man who survived being dragged under a river current as a child. For decades he refused to fish, swim, or even camp near water. He moved inland into the dry heart of the desert, believing distance would protect him. When he died, his family found his journals. Every page contained drawings of water. Pools, rivers, shapes beneath surfaces, faces with wide eyes and soft smiles, names written repeatedly, some crossed out, others circled. The last entry was a map, marked with a single spring hidden deep in a canyon he had never visited. The elders said the water had never forgotten him. It had simply waited. This was why children were warned never to speak to voices in the water, never to answer questions, never to give names. Names created bridges, and bridges could be crossed both ways. The water babies did not age. They did not tire. They remembered everyone who ever listened, and once remembered, you were never truly alone again. There are nights in the desert when nothing moves, no wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. The elders said those nights were the most dangerous, not because something was happening, but because something was about to. One such night is remembered across multiple tribes, retold in fragments that align too closely to dismiss. It occurred during a winter season when no storms were forecast, no snow melt fed the rivers, and no rain had fallen for weeks. Yet the water rose, not violently, not suddenly. It crept. Villages near rivers noticed it first. Water lines marked on stone steps were wrong by morning. Shallow crossings deepened overnight. Springs overflowed gently, spilling into ground that should have absorbed them easily. By sunset, people reported hearing movement beneath the water, slow, layered sounds like many small bodies shifting at once. Children were pulled indoors early. Fires were kept burning longer than usual. Songs were sung, not celebratory ones, but old melodies meant to remind the land who belonged where. That night, the crying began. It came from every direction, not loud, not desperate, soft, persistent, overlapping. As if many infants were murmuring at once, none urgent enough to demand action, yet impossible to ignore. People covered their ears, dogs howled, then fell silent. The water reflected the stars too clearly, like polished black glass. Those brave or foolish enough to look closely claimed they saw movement just beneath the surface, not splashing, not swimming, rising, faces tilted upward, pressing against the thin boundary between worlds, eyes glowing faintly with reflected starlight. The water babies had gathered. Elders later said this happens rarely, only when the balance is disturbed deeply enough. A convergence of memory, neglect, and opportunity. Too many boundaries crossed, too many voices ignored. The water did not overflow its banks. It waited. In the height of the night, one village heard footsteps approaching from the riverbank. Small, wet footsteps slapping softly against packed earth. Shadows moved at the edge of firelight, low to the ground, unhurried, curious. No one opened their doors. No one spoke. Those who peered through cracks in wooden walls described seeing shapes no longer than children, skin pale and gleaming, eyes reflecting firelight strangely. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly as if testing speech. They did not try to enter. They listened. By dawn, the water had receded to normal levels. The crying stopped. The desert exhaled. But several things were different. Footprints, small, webbed impressions were found near doorways, wells, and water jars. Marks appeared on clay pots used to store drinking water, like damp fingerprints that never fully dried. And 3 children were gone, not taken violently, not dragged. Their sleeping places were disturbed. It was as if they had simply followed something quietly into the night. Searches lasted days. Tracks led toward water sources, then vanished at the edge. No bodies were recovered, no signs of struggle found. The elders declared mourning immediately. Not hope, mourning. Because when the water babies took during a gathering, they did not return what they claimed. These children would not surface unchanged. They would not escape. They would not grow old. They would become voices. New cries, new calls, new lures shaped like innocence. From that night forward, certain waters were sealed completely, stone tagged, paths redirected, names erased from maps. Children were forbidden even to speak of those places aloud, because speaking names kept memories fresh, and memory fed the water. The elders said the water babies had grown numerous enough to test the surface openly, to walk briefly upon land, to remind people that forgetting has consequences. And if the balance ever tipped again, if the water was disrespected long enough, they would not stop at whispers. They would knock. The elders insisted that water carries memory. The few outside the tribes truly understood what that meant. It was not just the shape of the river, the flow of the stream, or the weight of the snowmelt that mattered. It was people, names, emotions, grief, laughter, fear, joy. Every drop of water that touched a human left a trace, and in the hidden pools, in the deep bends where no sunlight penetrated, those traces coalesced into something ancient and alive. One story tells of a young man traveling alone along the Rio Grande. He was from a distant settlement and did not know old warnings. Hunger led him to a pool tucked behind a sandstone ridge, a place local avoided entirely. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, still and inviting. He knelt to drink and froze when he heard a soft voice call his name, Mateo. His heart leapt. No one from his village had traveled this far. He looked around. The canyon was empty. Only the water reflected his image back to him. Mateo, come play. He staggered backward, tripping over a rock, but when he rose, he saw them. Pale figures emerging slowly from the pool. Children in appearance, their eyes too bright, their movements fluid like the water itself. They did not speak further. They merely watched, waiting for him to move closer. He tried to run. His feet felt heavy. His own shadow twisted across the stone, appearing to cling to him. The water babies were learning, adapting, not just to humans, but to fear itself. They knew hesitation. They knew longing. They knew him. Somehow they knew the names of everyone who had ever approached the water without care. That pool had witnessed generations, storing voices, faces, intentions. The children's eyes reflected centuries of this memory. He screamed, but the sound seemed muted by the air, absorbed by the canyon walls, and when he stumbled backward, the figures melted back into the water as if they had never left. Mateo ran without stopping, only finding relief when the canyon opened to open desert. Rivers and pools now distant, but at night, in dreams, he would hear the voices again, calling softly, repeating names, sometimes his, sometimes of people long gone. The elders explained that it was impossible to outrun the memory. The water babies did not exist in a single place. They were everywhere the water had touched and remembered. When settlers began moving into the Southwest, damming rivers and redirecting channels, some believed the water babies had disappeared. But the stories never stopped. Children still whispered of eyes below the water's surface. Adults occasionally vanished near abandoned reservoirs. Faint cries echoed in places no one had mapped. Some said the water babies could follow names, even across man-made canals, irrigation systems, and reservoirs. They were no longer confined to hidden desert pools. Every time someone ignored an old warning, they were testing a boundary older than the oldest canyon wall. The elders warned, "Do not speak your name to water you do not understand. Do not approach it alone. Do not trust the voice that mimics someone you love, because every whisper, every memory, every name the water collected only made the water babies stronger, and those who heard them without care were marked." By the time the elders gathered at dusk, their faces etched with age and worry, they no longer spoke simply of caution. They spoke of survival. The water babies were patient, yes, but they were persistent. Generations of knowledge, lost children, whispered warnings, and hidden footprints created a network of memory that expanded with every careless act of humans, and patience made them strategic. One night, a small group of young men ventured out to a river, believing the old tales were exaggeration. They laughed as they waded into a pool tucked beneath a canyon wall, splashing one another, mocking the stories. But the water was silent, unnervingly so. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the edges of the pool. Suddenly the air shifted. Tiny ripples appeared beneath their feet, though the surface remained unnaturally smooth. Shadows twisted beneath the water. One boy noticed it first, a pale hand reaching up from the depths, fingers spread, eyes fixed on him. Before he could warn his friends, the voices began, soft at first, overlapping, layered like the echoes of a canyon. "Come, play, do not leave, do not forget, we remember your name." Panic surged. He grabbed his companions, pulling at them frantically, but it was as if invisible chains held them to the edge of the pool. Some tripped, slipping into the water, only to resurface seconds later, gasping, drenched, but unharmed. It was a test. The water babies did not attack recklessly. They evaluated, measured, and learned. They watched how humans reacted: fear, hesitation, denial, laughter, and adopted their approach. The boys learned the lesson the hard way. Mockery was a vulnerability. That night, the elders convened after the commotion had passed. They spoke of patterns. The deep the memory, the older the water babies, the more cunning the approach. They described how even adults, skeptical of stories, could be tempted by faint cries, by laughter that sounded too much like a lost child, by whispers that mimicked familiar voices. An elder told of a boy who wandered too close to a desert pool at dawn, calling softly to his missing sister. The water responded, not angrily, not violently, but curiously. A small figure rose slowly, imitating the sister's laugh perfectly. The boy stepped forward, entranced. The elder intervened, pulling the boy back, but he had already glimpsed the truth. Water babies did not merely imitate. They learned to inhabit the roles humans needed most. By sunrise, the desert returned to its usual quiet. The pool reflected the sky perfectly. Ripples long vanished, but the elders knew what remained beneath: consciousness, patience, and memory older than human settlements. They reminded one another and their communities. Water remembers names. Water recalls faces. Water absorbs intentions. And the water babies, as custodians of that memory, could reach across time, across terrain, and across generations. They were everywhere water lingered, and they were never in a hurry. The lesson passed from parents to children was simple but urgent: respect the water. Never enter it alone. Never speak your name aloud near its surface. Leave offerings if necessary. Sing old songs. Acknowledge what has been lost, because those who ignored the lessons rarely returned unchanged. The elders concluded that night, eyes reflecting firelight and moonlight, that survival was more than avoiding the surface. It was remembering, it was listening, it was acknowledging the unseen. Unhurried, patient watchers who had been waiting long before humans named the rivers, and who would wait long after. Once a year, the desert tribes held a ceremony not meant for outsiders, a festival of remembrance, where families honored those who had vanished, those who returned changed, and the waters that bore them. Candles lined riverbanks, offerings floated on the surface, and songs, ancient, haunting, melodic, rose into the night. But one year the festival went differently. The elders had warned, never push the water too far. Speak it in moderation. Sing, but do not provoke. Leave offerings, but do not demand attention. It was a delicate balance, once that had kept the water babies patient for centuries. That night, a group of young festival-goers, unaware of the subtleties, began splashing playfully, daring each other to venture into deeper pools. Laughter carried too loudly across the water. Some even began chanting, mimicking the songs in exaggerated, careless ways. The water stirred. At first, it was gentle, ripples across the surface, almost playful. Then the ripples multiplied, moving in patterns that defied wind or current. Shadows, faint and elongated, began rising from beneath, weaving through the moonlit water. Small faces emerged, some familiar, some strange, all staring at the intruders with calm, cold curiosity. Voices layered, overlapping, echoing unnaturally. Do you remember? Do you know your name? Who do you call when no one is there? Panic surged. Some tried to flee, but paths to the shore seemed to twist and stretch. One young girl, terrified, froze as a small figure mimicked her sister perfectly. Hair, clothes, even gestures. The figure's eyes gleamed with unearthly knowledge, and it whispered, "Stay with us. It is warm here." Parents ran forward, grabbing children, dragging them to safety. The water babies did not resist. They did not strike, but the memory of the encounter lingered like a shadow pressed against their minds. No one spoke of it aloud for days. No one mentioned the whispers, the faces, the uncanny mimicry. By dawn, the water returned to its place it stayed. Offerings remained afloat, candles burned down, but small footprints marked the edge of pools, webbed, impossible, fading before anyone could examine them closely. Elders spoke quietly, gravely. The water babies had been awakened. Patience had not ended. They had simply moved closer to the surface to watch. The festival became legend, whispered warnings rather than celebration. Families remembered that those waters were not a playground. They were teachers, patient and eternal, and those who ignored their lessons would be taught in ways the elders did not need to explain. Even decades later, some survivors recalled the sensation of being watched, not with malice, but with expectant curiosity. The water babies had learned to move beyond pools and springs. They had learned how to observe without being seen, to follow names, to recognize patterns, to test boundaries without rushing. And the desert had learned to speak, respect the water, remember the lost, do not provoke what watches from beneath, because the water babies, patient, silent, and eternal, could wait for centuries for someone to forget, and when forgotten, they would rise, not angrily, but inevitably. Years passed, and the stories of water babies traveled quietly among villages and desert settlements. Outsiders rarely believed them, dismissing the tales as folklore. But for those who lived along the rivers and hidden pools, the warnings were as real as the sun's heat on cracked stone. One summer, during a period of unusually high snowmelt, a young boy named Elias wandered near a secluded spring hidden deep in a canyon. The elders had warned him to stay clear, but curiosity, strengthened by tales of vanished children, led him forward. The water shimmered unusually bright under the afternoon sun, almost alive, reflecting not only the sky, but the canyon walls in subtle, unnatural movements. Elias bent down to touch the surface, and that's when he heard it. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, calling his full name. His breath caught. The voice wasn't loud, and yet it resonated deep inside him, echoing through his chest and spine. He looked around. The canyon was empty. No wind, no birds, only the water. Elias, the voice said again, slower, more deliberate. Come closer. He stumbled backward. The surface rippled, forming shapes. Small humanoid figures that seemed to swim just beneath the water's skin. Eyes glinted, pale and unnervingly reflective. Hands moved toward him, delicate and precise, not grasping, but inviting. Elias' instincts screamed. He turned to run, but the canyon seemed longer, shadows twisting unnaturally, narrowing his escape. The whispers intensified, layered with the echoes of children who had once disappeared, all calling in unison. And then he felt it, a gentle tug at his ankle, like a hand pressing from beneath, not violent, not forceful, but insistent, patient. The boy fell, scrambling backward, rolling across stone until he reached the dry bank. He scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, heart pounding, and ran without looking back until the canyon walls gave way to the open desert. When he returned home, Elias spoke of what he saw. His parents, stricken with fear, consulted the elders. The elders said only one thing: the water remembers every name it has heard, every cry, every step, every child. It will call again until it is acknowledged, until it is respected. You were chosen to see, to remember, not to join. Never forget what you saw today, Elias. And in that night, the boy dreamed. He dreamed of small hands brushing his face underwater, of faces that mirrored his lost siblings, of whispers and voices he knew, repeating his name, soft, patient, eternal. The water babies were not cruel. They were persistent. They were guardians of memory, holders of names, observers of humanity's carelessness, and those who ignored their power learned a truth far deeper than fear. The water does not forgive. It waits, it calls, it remembers. By now, the water babies were no longer stories told only in whispers. Their presence had expanded across the desert waterways, infiltrating rivers, pools, and hidden springs that even locals considered safe. Some elders spoke openly of encounters, while others remained silent, feared that speaking would attract attention. One night, a group of brave teenagers, more curious than cautious, ventured to an abandoned canal where water pooled beneath an old stone bridge. The water glimmered unnaturally, reflecting starlight in strange patterns that seemed almost like symbols, etched by the movement beneath. At first, the teenagers laughed, tossing rocks into the canal, but the water responded, not with splashes, not with sound, but with movement that defied logic. Shapes surfaced briefly, pale, human-eyed, too small to be human. Eyes glimmered, reflecting the moonlight like fragments of glass. Then came the voices, soft, layered, and intimately familiar. Don't leave me. Play with me. Your name. Remember. Panic rose. They ran along the canal, but the terrain felt unfamiliar, stretched unnaturally, twisting like the water itself was bending the world. Some tripped, others froze, staring at the water as if it had suddenly grown alive, reaching toward them. One teenager, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, looked directly at the pool. He noticed the smallest figure stepping forward, delicate features illuminated under the moon. The figure's eyes were old, as if they carried centuries of memory, and its mouth moved silently before the voice followed. You are remembered. Do not forget. The boy screamed, falling backward, hitting stone. When he looked up, the figure had vanished, leaving only ripples on the water's surface. The other teenagers fled, their laughter now gone, replaced by a heavy silence, and yet every one of them later admitted that for hours afterward they could hear the softest splashes, like tiny feet running across water in their homes. Sometimes a whisper repeated their names, faint but unmistakable. The elders explained the water babies had expanded their domain. They could now touch human lives without direct contact, following the memory of names, guiding or testing anyone who came too close. They did not act with anger, not yet. They acted with purpose. Stories spread. Families found bowls of water slightly disturbed on porches. Pools appeared to shimmer at night as if reflecting unseen figures. Children sometimes returned home humming melodies of unknown origin, small hands wet with nothing but condensation. It became clear the water babies were no longer passive. They could interact with this world subtly, drawing attention to themselves only when they wanted to, and patience remained their greatest weapon. The elders' warnings grew sharper. Never go near water alone. Never call your own name aloud. Never mock or test the waters. Never forget those who vanished, because the water babies would remember every failure, every lapse, every broken rule, and when they acted, it would be in ways that humans could not control or even comprehend. By dawn, the canal was calm. The water reflected stars like polished glass. The teenagers' footprints had vanished, leaving the bridge and pool untouched as if nothing had happened. But the elders knew the truth. The water babies had claimed another story, adding it to centuries of memory, waiting, patient, eternal. And for the desert, the silence that followed was a warning louder than any voice. The desert sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across riverbeds and canyon walls. For the elders, each dawn brought both relief and dread. They knew that water remembered and that memory had power beyond human understanding. One particularly dry summer, after weeks without rain, a family settled near a small spring unaware of the legends. The parents were new to the region, drawn by fertile land and reliable water. Their children played along the banks, laughing, throwing stones, their voices carrying across the still water. At first, nothing happened. The family felt safe. The spring appeared normal, its surface calm and inviting. Then the water moved, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to ripple unnaturally, as if it breathed. Shadows shifted beneath, small faces peeking briefly above the surface, eyes reflecting sunlight in impossible ways. A child, curious and fearless, stepped closer. The water babies, patient as always, began their call, soft, melodic, hypnotic. Come closer. Your name, we remember. The parents shouted, but sound seemed dulled, absorbed by the canyon walls and the rippling surface. The children froze, mesmerized, as pale hands rose from beneath the water, delicate yet persistent, inviting, not threatening. The elders later reconstructed the scene from witnesses. The children did not vanish violently. They were drawn, slowly, gently, beneath the surface, not drowned, not harmed, suspended in water that seemed to hold them weightless, their small faces calm, eyes wide with understanding and recognition. From above, the parents saw ripples and faint glimmers, but nothing else. When the children emerged hours later, they were unchanged physically, but something was different. They spoke of a world beneath the water where time moved strangely, where the water babies gathered everyone who had ever forgotten their names. They saw the faces of children long lost, of friends, of strangers. They learned that the water was alive, not as humans understand life, but as a vast, patient, eternal consciousness that recorded, observed, and occasionally released. They came back with memories humans could barely comprehend, songs hummed under their breath that no human had taught them. Small, pale hands traced shapes in their air as though still submerged. They avoided even the shallowest pools, and reflections unsettled them. The elders explained to the parents that the children were now keepers of memory, bridging the world above with the world beneath. They had survived, but they would never truly be free of the water. The water babies, silent and patient, had achieved something profound. They did not need to strike. They did not need to harm. They only needed to remember. Every person who had forgotten, every voice lost, every name unspoken had been noted, archived, and watched. The water could reach across rivers, across pools, across generations, and when the memory demanded acknowledgement, it would call. As night fell, the desert rivers gleamed under moonlight. Shadows moved beneath surfaces, gentle and deliberate. The elders lit small fires along the banks, whispered songs and names of the lost. Offerings floated on the water, a silent pact renewed. And somewhere beneath the surface, countless small figures, water babies, waited, patient as the earth itself, eternal as the memory they kept. They would always watch, they would always call, and in the end, they would always remember. The story ends here, but in the desert, the water never does. Its memory flows onward, deeper, wider, eternal.